You don't deserve to be here. He didn't whisper it. He projected it, clean, flat, and sharp enough to turn heads in the chapel foyer. I didn't have to look to know the voice. Evan McKinley. Slate suit. Perfect posture. The human embodiment of a warning label. I kept my hands folded around the program. Daniel Aaron McKinley 1983 to 2024, and made myself breathe. Grief is heavy. Pride is heavier. Together they can crush you if you let them. I'm Harper Vance, 38, and today I'm burying my husband. That should buy a person the right to stand quietly under a chandelier without being tried in the court of public opinion. Apparently not in the McKinley family. A few guests pretended not to hear. A few didn't bother. The McKinleys collect wealth managers and whispered judgments the way other families collect Christmas ornaments. The foyer smelled like lilies and polished wood, and everything in it, from the oil paintings to the murmurs, belonged to them. Everything except me. Evan stepped closer, lowering his voice now that he'd secured an audience. Some of us were actually there for Daniel, he said, eyes raking over my navy dress like it had broken a rule. You're a complication. I could have reminded him that I was the one who sat beside Daniel in ERs at 3 a.m., who memorized the names of his cardiologists, who learned to read the quiet between his breaths. I could have said a lot of things. Instead, I let the silence do the work. I've learned that silence makes arrogant men uncomfortable. He smiled, that cool country club smile that never reaches the eyes. Don't cause a scene, Harper. Not today. I didn't move. I won't. He waited for more. When none came, he tilted his head, the verdict delivered, and drifted back toward a cluster of dark suits and sympathetic hands on shoulders. His element. A hand brushed my elbow. You okay? It was Lena, my closest friend since college, the only person here who didn't measure my worth by last names and donation tiers. I'm fine, I said. It wasn't true, but it was useful. Because here's what Evan didn't know. I was ready. Not for a fight in a foyer. Not for a public spectacle. For something quieter. Something official. The kind of ready that lives in signatures and sealed envelopes and the last careful decision a good man makes before the world stops recognizing his heartbeat. Across the room, the family attorney Margaret Cole slipped through the door from the rain, closing her umbrella with practiced efficiency. She met my eyes for a fraction of a second and gave the smallest nod. The kind that says, I have it. We are on schedule. My pulse steadied. Lena followed my gaze. That her? That's her. Then breathe, Lena whispered. And remember who Daniel trusted. The organist began a slow prelude. Ushers moved to open the double doors to the chapel. The crowd shifted, a coordinated tide of black fabric and low conversation. Evan glanced back at me one more time, satisfied that his sentence had landed where he wanted it. It had. Just not in the way he expected. The McKinleys have always been storytellers. Not the kind that use truth as a foundation, but the kind that build it like a stage set. From the outside, the family looks like an oil painting. Tasteful, expensive, untouchable. Up close, the paint starts to crack. When I married Daniel 10 years ago, I stepped straight into that portrait. I thought I'd been accepted, until I realized I'd only been cast in a supporting role. The family story was already written, and I was just a prop they could move in and out of frame. Daniel's father, Charles McKinley, liked his narratives tidy. The oldest son, Blake, running the firm's New York office. Evan, the charismatic cousin who was supposed to inherit the philanthropic arm of the empire. And Daniel, the reluctant heir with a rebellious streak, the one who chose me over a list of vetted debutantes. I never fit the mold. My parents were public school teachers from Roanoke. People who believed in fixing what you had instead of replacing it. I'd worked my way through college in a thrift store, then built a career in nonprofit fundraising. Respectable, yes, but in the McKinley dictionary, respectable ranks well below strategically advantageous. Evan made sure I understood that from the start. At every holiday dinner, his compliments were weapons wrapped in ribbon. Harper, you really make the most of what you've got, he'd say with that smile that made my skin itch. Or, charity work, how noble. It must be nice not to worry about metrics that actually matter. I bit my tongue more times than I can count because Daniel hated conflict and I loved Daniel more than I hated Evan. But quiet tolerance has a way of building its own kind of debt, one you intend to collect someday. And the truth? Evan wasn't just arrogant. He was strategic. Every polite insult was a rehearsal for the day he'd run the McKinley Foundation. a role he considered his birthright. In his version of the family story, I was a footnote. But Daniel had been rewriting that ending long before Evan knew there was a pen in play. Daniel's death didn't arrive with warning signs. No long illness to prepare for, no calendar of fading weeks. Just a phone call at 6:14 a.m., slicing through the quiet like glass breaking. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Daniel had kissed me goodbye, coffee still on his breath, saying he'd be home early. 30 minutes later he was collapsed in the parking lot of his firm's downtown office. A stranger kneeling beside him with trembling hands and a cell phone pressed to his ear. By the time I reached St. Mary's Hospital, they'd done everything they could. The air smelled like antiseptic and rain. A storm had rolled in while I was driving. I remember staring at the clock on the wall, trying to make sense of the numbers as the doctor's words blurred together. Massive heart attack. Immediate. Nothing more we could. Evan arrived before Daniel's parents. Not for me, for optics. He walked in, coat still dry, clasping my shoulder like it was a staged photograph. "I'll take care of things," he said as if logistics were the problem. The McKinleys moved fast after that. Within 48 hours they'd secured the largest chapel in Richmond, booked the quartet, and approved a guest list that looked more like a donor gala than a memorial. Evan oversaw every decision, from the flower arrangements to which clergy member would give the eulogy. My input? Minimal. "You'll be too emotional," Evan had said. "Let us handle the details." But there was one detail no one asked about because no one outside of me, Daniel, and our attorney knew it existed: the final version of his will. The one Daniel had signed exactly 13 days before that Tuesday morning. In it he'd left me something more powerful than a house, a bank account, or a title. He'd left me control over the one thing Evan wanted more than his next promotion. And in a week's time, standing in the grand hall of the McKinley estate after Daniel's funeral, everyone would find out. The last time Daniel and I talked about the McKinley Foundation, it was over takeout Thai on our back porch. He was barefoot, leaning back in the old wicker chair that creaked when he laughed. "I've spent 6 years watching Evan circle that place like a shark," he said, chopsticks paused midair. "The man sees it as a resume booster, not a lifeline for communities." I'd smiled because Daniel's conviction was always one of the things I loved most about him. "So what are you going to do?" What I should have done a long time ago. 2 weeks later he sat in Margaret Cole's office, the McKinley's own attorney, though Daniel had hired her personally for this, and signed the revisions. The McKinley Foundation, with its multimillion-dollar endowment, would be mine to direct. Sole authority. No board interference. No family vetoes. And it was spelled out in black ink, witnessed, notarized, and sealed. The brilliance of Daniel's plan wasn't just in giving me control. It was in the timing. The will instructed that the announcement be made publicly at the reception following his funeral. No whispered family meeting. No time for Evan to mount a counterattack. Once Margaret read those words aloud, the room would know instantly, and so would every influential ear in Richmond. I'd kept that knowledge locked down for 13 days. I played the grieving widow, which I was, but under the grief was a steady current of something else. Readiness. And today, as the chapel filled with the rustle of expensive fabric and the clink of polished cufflinks, that readiness felt like a loaded chamber. Evan had no idea he'd already lost. The chapel was the kind you see in glossy magazines: vaulted ceilings, sunlight cutting through stained glass, the air faintly perfumed with lilies and polished wood. Every pew was filled not just with family and friends, but with people who had done business with the McKinleys, people who came to be seen as much as to pay respects. I sat in the front row, Lena beside me, Daniel's parents on my other side. Evan stood a few feet away, shaking hands with a local congressman, his face the perfect blend of grief and status. The eulogies were curated. The minister spoke of Daniel's unwavering dedication to the McKinley legacy, glossing over the fact that he'd spent the last 5 years quietly pulling away from the family's control. His mother read a poem, delicate, controlled, designed not to smudge her mascara. When it was over, the procession to the graveside began. Rain misted down, soft but steady, dampening the shoulders of black coats. The sound of the final prayers was nearly drowned by the patter on the tent overhead. Evan took it upon himself to direct the crowd toward the estate afterward. "Receptions at the hall," he announced, as though this were his event to host. He avoided looking at me, but I caught the way he glanced at my navy dress again. a silent rebuke for not wearing the morning uniform he'd all but dictated. In the car ride back, I kept my eyes on the window, watching Richmond's old brick buildings blur by. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory from our last phone call. "We'll read it exactly as Daniel wrote it. No edits, no delay." By the time we pulled through the iron gates of the McKinley estate, my pulse had settled into something steady and deliberate. The storm was moving in behind us, but the real weather was about to break inside. The McKinley estate's grand hall was all marble floors and chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a European palace. A string quartet played something elegant but forgettable in the corner, their bows moving in perfect synchronization. Servers in crisp white jackets drifted between clusters of guests, offering champagne flutes and small plates topped with things too delicate to actually fill you. Evan was in his element. He navigated the room like a man campaigning for office. Firm handshakes, warm smiles, just enough somberness to be respectable. If you didn't know him, you'd think he was grieving. I stayed near the French doors where I could see the gardens blurred by rain. Lena stood close enough to shield me from the occasional pity conversation. From across the room, I spotted Margaret Cole slipping in, her black leather portfolio tucked under her arm. She caught my eye and gave the smallest, most deliberate nod. That was the signal. Evan noticed her too. I watched his expression shift, recognition then calculation. He moved toward her, intercepting her halfway across the room. They exchanged a few words I couldn't hear over the music, but his posture was confident, almost smug. He thought this meeting was about him. When Margaret finally stepped up to the front of the hall, she didn't ask for a microphone. She simply tapped the edge of a champagne flute with a silver pen. The sound cut cleanly through the room. "May I have your attention, please?" The quartet stopped. Conversations fell into silence. Evan stood near the front, angled toward the crowd like a man about to accept an award. Margaret opened her portfolio, removed a single sealed envelope and glanced at me before speaking. "This is a statement prepared by Mr. Daniel McKinley, to be read following his memorial service, in the presence of his family, friends, and colleagues." She broke the seal. And for the first time all day, Evan's smile didn't look entirely secure. Margaret's voice was steady, deliberate, the kind that carried without needing to be raised. "To my family and friends, thank you for gathering to honor my life today. I wish I could be here to say these words myself, but I take comfort in knowing they will reach you in this room." A rustle moved through the crowd, the shifting of silk and wool. Evan stood tall, hands clasped in front of him, a model of solemn attention. "The McKinley Foundation has been my greatest professional pride. For years, I have dreamed of expanding its reach and deepening its impact beyond the constraints of tradition. To make that happen, I am appointing my wife, Harper Vance McKinley, as the sole director of the McKinley Foundation, effective immediately. She will hold full authority over its operations, initiatives, and future direction." Silence. The kind that feels like the air has been pulled out of the room. Evan's head jerked toward me before he could stop himself. His expression was a perfect storm, confusion at the words, disbelief that they'd been spoken aloud, and the first flicker of panic creeping in around the edges. Margaret continued, unfazed. "I make this decision because I trust Harper's vision, her judgment, and her integrity above all else. I have seen firsthand her ability to bring people together, to turn resources into real change. I know she will lead with the same heart and conviction she has shown me every day of our marriage." From somewhere in the crowd came a quiet, sharp inhale. Lena's hand brushed mine briefly, grounding me. Margaret closed the folder, her gaze sweeping the room. Those were Daniel's exact words. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Charles McKinley, still seated beside me, turned toward Margaret with a stunned, almost mechanical politeness. "Thank you, Miss Cole." But across the room, Evan's composure had cracked. The mask was slipping and everyone was watching. Evan recovered just enough to paste on a smile that didn't match the tension in his jaw. He stepped forward, addressing the room as if he could smooth over the last 30 seconds by sheer force of charm. "Well," he said, chuckling softly, "that's unexpected. I'm sure we'll all be here to support Harper in whatever she needs." The way he said whatever carried an edge sharp enough to draw blood. Margaret's voice cut through before he could reclaim the narrative. "Mr. McKinley, the transfer of authority is already filed with the state and the Foundation's bank. There's no transition period beyond what Mrs. McKinley deems necessary. A low ripple of murmurs spread through the hall. People who moments ago had been holding champagne flutes now seemed far more interested in watching Evan's face. I took a step forward, meeting the gaze of a half-dozen people whose donations kept the foundation alive. Daniel believed in the work we could do together, I said, my voice steady. I intend to honor that trust, and his legacy, by ensuring the foundation serves not just the McKinley name, but the communities it was built to help. I could feel Evan's stare drilling into the side of my face, but I didn't look at him. Not yet. From the back of the room, an older board member, Graham Whitmore, spoke up. It's good to hear, Harper. The foundation has been in need of fresh vision for some time. That single comment seemed to shift the air. Heads nodded. A few people offered quiet words of agreement. Evan opened his mouth, maybe to counter, maybe to reclaim some authority, but when our eyes finally met, I didn't blink. And for the first time since I'd met him, he looked away first. The reception didn't end so much as dissolve. Conversations reformed in smaller, tighter circles, and I noticed the subtle migration, donors and community leaders drifting toward me, while Evan's corner of the room grew thinner by the minute. Lena stayed close, intercepting anyone who seemed more interested in gossip than condolences. You're the sun right now, she murmured. He's just figuring out he's not the center of the solar system anymore. Evan, however, wasn't retreating quietly. I caught glimpses of him leaning in to speak with Charles, with Daniel's mother, even with a few of the board members. His gestures were sharp, his tone low but urgent, the body language of someone trying to repair a sinking ship with a teacup. At one point he made his way toward me. A word, he said, his smile stretched thin enough to show strain. We can talk at the office, I replied. This isn't an office matter, he said, stepping closer. You don't understand the politics of this role. The donors, the partnerships, these are relationships I've cultivated for years. If you alienate them, I think they're capable of deciding for themselves who they trust, I said, glancing past him toward Graham Whitmore, who was now in animated conversation with Margaret about potential new programs. His jaw tightened. Harper, this is bigger than you. I let the pause hang just long enough to see the flicker in his eyes. No, Evan. This is exactly as big as me. Daniel made sure of it. I turned away before he could answer, joining Graham and Margaret by the fireplace. Over Evan's shoulder, I caught Lena watching, a small, satisfied smile on her face. The McKinley story had shifted. And for once I wasn't the supporting role. By the time the last guests filtered out, the grand hall felt too large for the handful of us who remained. The quartet had packed up, the champagne trays were gone, and only the muted hum of rain against the windows filled the space. Charles and Daniel's mother retreated upstairs without much more than a polite nod in my direction. I didn't take it personally. They'd built their world around a very specific hierarchy, and today I'd redrawn the map. Evan lingered near the far wall, pretending to check his phone. I knew he was waiting for me to walk past him, to give him one last opportunity to reassert some kind of control. When I finally crossed the marble floor toward the French doors, he straightened. You've made a mistake, he said quietly. No, I replied, meeting his eyes without slowing. I've made a decision. His gaze flicked over me, searching for hesitation, for the smallest sign of uncertainty he could pry open later. But there was nothing left to find. You think this will end well for you? He asked. I don't think, I said. I know. Because I'm not running the foundation for me. That seemed to catch him off guard, enough to break his practiced poise. For a fraction of a second I saw the truth. The frustration of losing something he'd assumed was already his, the disbelief that Daniel had trusted me more than him. I stepped past him and opened the door, letting the cool night air and the sound of rain spill into the hall. When I glanced back, he was still standing there, silent, his phone hanging forgotten in his hand. That was the last look. And I knew as I walked out into the rain, that it wouldn't be the last time he thought about it.